According to the BBC, dress code etiquette states that women must cover their head for formal events, like yesterday's coronation. Carolyn, could you run through some of the pictures for us? There's Kate Middleton, the beautiful Prince Charlotte, Queen of Spain, Lady Louise, that's a nice hat, Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, Pippa Middleton. We have the Queen of Jordan, it's very stylish, Mary of Denmark, Beatrice, Eugenie, Carol Middleton. There's another lady, don't know her, but Laura Lopez, Prince of Norway. Keep going down there. Oh, the Princess of Monaco, Netherlands. Katy Perry, there's an international leader for you. Finnegan Bynum, and there, let's just stop there. There's our beautiful Prime Minister's wife with her nice hat. Now, we could do a little wordplay, couldn't we? According to not the BBC, but BCC, Byron Community Church, dress code etiquette states, as well as 1 Corinthians, that women must cover their head for church services. Is that the case? Good old 1 Corinthians 11. Extraordinarily controversial, brutally complex, filled with heavy theology, vocabulary ambiguity, taxing syntax, confusing background details, a source of debate and disagreement over the years, a passage begging to be bypassed, a passage that we would prefer to brush off, a passage where pastors and congregations bring to it their backgrounds, their biases, and yes, even their baggage. It's why I think knowing where a preacher is coming from, dealing with 1 Corinthians 11, 2-16 is very important. It's why this morning, you understanding where I'm coming from, I hope is going to be helpful. So let me give you a little bit of what I call my 1 Corinthians 11 bio or journey. Many of you knew that I grew up in the Brethren movement. If you're not familiar with the Brethren movement, that's okay. We'll pray for you, but I grew up in the Brethren movement. And one of our distinctives back then was women having their heads covered. Some of you come from similar denominations or similar movements. For me as a young guy, it was never an issue. It was taught, it was understood. Women covered their head. When it became a little bit of an issue for me, 1 Corinthians 11, was when I went through my long hair phase. Believe it or not, I had that. And it was pointed out to me that it was a disgrace. It was shameful for a man to have long hair. I didn't like that part of the passage. When it came to the time where I began dating, I always dated good Brethren girls. And there was no question about head covering. Then Heather came along. Now, Heather grew up in a gospel hall, but she was attending what was then a community chapel, which then was a buzzword for quasi-brethren, a church with brethren roots, but not really brethren. So in her background, she was used to head covering, but had been attending a church, a member of that church, where head covering wasn't promoted. So we began dating, and her first big outing in Toronto, where she met my family and other members of our church, was at the big Easter conference held in Toronto. Now, that was a big event. That particular year, in 1985, I was the pianist for the event. There were about 2,000 people there. So Heather had no choice. We were sitting up front, and she realized that she would need head covering to fit in. And so, to me, my memory of that event, she was dressed in a beautiful dress and nice shoes and the whole bit, but she had a really nice hat. Heather and her mom went out somewhere here in London. I guess there were hat shops back then, and purchased a lovely hat for the occasion. We got married, and I began pastoring at Don Valley. There was a bit of a shift, but our policy at Don Valley was women, it wasn't enforced, head covering, but strongly encouraged, to the point where we had a mannequin head. And that mannequin head had veils, or what we called mantillas, that were put on the head. And if a woman came in without her head covered, she was strongly encouraged to grab one of those veils and plunk it on her head. So there's a thin line between enforced and strongly encouraged. Well, we began to shift even more, and for 2.5 years on our elders' agenda, we dealt with head covering. And it was very contentious, hotly debated. I was representing a minority point of view. I suppose you could say that my side won out, but it didn't feel like a victory. I was going head to head, so to speak, with some formidable men who I respected very much, very godly men who took a different view on this passage. I was kind of glad when we moved to Byron, where at Byron Chapel then, head covering wasn't an issue. Although in my first month, did you know, I had a couple of elders take me aside and said, John, in coming to Byron, we do hope that you'll be able to push Byron back in a more brethren direction. I think I failed. So my apology to those two men. And it never was a big issue here, although, as you know, I continue to teach at a fairly conservative Brethren Bible College, and was able to avoid the issue of head covering until the one day I walked into a student area and they were having a debate about head covering, and a lot of the young women were wondering why did they have to wear these doilies on their head every time they went out as a choir group to perform. They asked for my opinion. I tried to do the Sergeant Schultz routine. You remember my favorite Schultz, Sergeant Schultz from Hogan's Hero. I know nothing. I see nothing. It didn't work that day. And I gave an opinion. I think it was a fairly balanced opinion, but I was glad to get out of that situation. Back here, as I said, not an issue, although I must admit there's been a couple of times. We were reminded yesterday at Iron Sharpens Iron of the street preachers who visited us, who had major issues with how our women were dressed, the length of our women's hair. Did you know that about 2 months after that, I had an encounter with them over at Tim's here in Byron. And they invited me over, and I went over, and we had actually an amicable chat for about a half an hour. What amazed me and impressed me was that they knew this passage in 1 Corinthians 11 by heart. They had memorized it. Now, where it got a little tricky was when I said, well, you know, guys, I've looked at this, in fact, spent 2.5 years writing position papers and debating it. I said, have you ever looked at what the passage says about men? They were a bit stunned and surprised, and I can't blame them because a lot of scholars and preachers overlook what is said about men in this passage in 1 Corinthians. Just before the pandemic, we had a young couple visit us. Very nice couple, a couple of children. She had her head covered. She had a veil on. And after the service, the young fellow came up to me, the husband, and he said, John, that was a great sermon. I said, thanks. Then he said, but, and I'm always nervous when somebody says but. He said, I wonder if you could explain why don't the women have their head covered? I was tempted to say, well, look at that woman. What about that? What would happen today, by the way, if somebody came in and asked that question, and I directed them to you? As a woman, what would you do? Would you do the Sergeant Schultz routine? I know nothing. Or would you play what I call ping pong? Tough issue ping pong, you'd say, ask one of the elders. Ask Pastor John, and we just go kind of back and forth on it. My last little story goes back a bit further. It was a student Her name was Sue, one of the best students I've ever had at the college, and well over 1,000 students, but she was extremely bright. And I remember Sue saying to me, John, I grew up in a little church where we practiced head covering. And she said, the message was, you must have your head covered. Said, I've gone to university. I'm just here for a year of Bible college, but I went to university and was attending a church where it was almost regarded as silly for a woman to have her head covered. So the message I got was, you must not have your head covered. Said, so I'm confused. Is head covering something I must do or must not do? And then her zinger was, said, I know there's a lot of opinion on this. But she said, John, I take my faith very seriously. I take what the Word of God says very seriously. Could you give me some guidance? Could you give me some help? Sue has gone off and has really accomplished a lot. Sue, if there's any chance that you're listening to this sermon today online, this sermon is for this congregation, but it's also for you. And I hope what we're going to look at is going to be helpful. If you haven't turned in your Bible to 1 Corinthians 11, turn to it. This is going to be a different kind of message. My title this morning, I went the safe route. I'm a bit of a wimp. I've called my sermon Hat Day. I was so tempted to use the title, Woman, Cover Your Head. I was told that would not be a good title. I actually find it a little offensive myself. I was also tempted to go a bit of a scholarly direction. 1 Corinthians 11, a hermeneutical nightmare. Hermeneutics, of course, is the study of understanding and interpreting Scripture, and it is a very scary passage. Difficult, and as I said earlier, very complex. The approach that we're using this morning, I have been very intentional about a long introduction. In fact, I wish sometimes that other preachers and writers would give a long introduction to declare their background and biases. Our approach today is not going to be linear. I love preaching in a linear style. Point 1, point 2, point 3. Unfortunately, Paul in 1 Corinthians 11 is circular. He is all over the place. It makes it very difficult as he jumps from topic to topic. It even makes it a bit confusing. I would love to be thorough with this passage today, but it would take us to about 4 o'clock to give a complete exposition on each verse. So you can accuse me today in advance of skimming over this passage. We do have an annual meeting, and I do not want to infringe on the timing of the annual meeting. Plus, I am headed to Cleveland this afternoon, so I don't want to miss my ride to Cleveland. So we will keep things moving at a pretty brisk pace that way. What I'd like to do is deal with some issues. I'd like to talk about clarifying some of the categories that we need to use. I'd like to talk about Paul's concerns. What were some of his motivations for writing this passage in 1 Corinthians 11? And then the $64,000 question, but with inflation, it's now $88,000 question. What is head covering? What is headship? And what meaning do we assign to headship? That's a very vital question. And then moving on to a very practical question, so what about head covering? Is Paul referring to hair? Is he referring to hats, a veil, some kind of hood or hoodie? A combination of both, hair and something that you're putting on your head like a veil or a hat. What is he referring to? Now, a warning before we get into these different areas. I often use the phrase sanctified speculation. This morning will be sanctified speculation on steroids, because there are a lot of questions and a lot of uncertainties with this passage. There are passages of Scripture where I'm prepared to be real dogmatic. This isn't one of them. So I hope that I demonstrate a lot of humility as we look at this passage. Paul in verse 16 says we shouldn't be contentious about these things. I am not out today to create conflict or to create some kind of head-covering war It's not my intention today at all. In fact, my guess is today you're going to leave with more questions than answers. And that's a good thing. If you leave today with more answers than questions, I failed. I want to provoke you to think a little bit about some of these issues. And sometimes it's good to have a lot of questions. I call this a graduate level sermon. So roll up your sleeves. There's some times that we look for a good, simple, straightforward sermon. This won't be one of them. This is a graduate level sermon. The context I always think is important. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at 1 Corinthians 11 through 14. We're going to be seeing decency and order when it comes to corporate worship. Yeah, we're going to be looking, hard as this passage is, start of next month, we get to look at what does it mean in 1 Corinthians 14 for women to remain silent in the church. Fun times are coming. So I should have assigned that to Pastor Josh. I don't know what I was thinking there. The other thing I'd say about context is we've spent a lot of time the last few weeks looking at 1 Corinthians 8 to 10 about rights and freedoms. I believe that one of the secrets to unlocking the key meanings in 1 Corinthians 11 is to understand the significance of a willingness to relinquish what might seem to be to us some of our rights and freedoms. So, can we clarify categories? There are some parts of Scripture that we would call doctrine, other parts we call areas of conviction. There's areas of preference. In this case, I think it's important we ask, can we make a distinction between what is the principle and what is the practice in 1 Corinthians 11? Let me take it further. What parts of 1 Corinthians 11, 2 to 16 are timeless? They apply to all times, to every age, to every church, and every situation and circumstance. And then what parts of 1 Corinthians 11 are culturally sensitive? They specifically apply to a specific culture or time in history. Now, we should also ask, even if they apply in a specific sense, are there bigger lessons or insights that we can draw from these situations? Some have made a distinction, and I like this one, between the attitude in 1 Corinthians 11, 2 to 16, and the attire in 1 Corinthians 11, 2 to 16. I find that, for my sake, a bit of a helpful distinction. So what are some of Paul's concerns and motivations? And I would call these timeless concerns and motivations. Across the spectrum, and there's a lot of disagreement when it comes to 1 Corinthians 11, 2 to 16, but across the spectrum, there is general agreement that Paul is concerned about a blurring of gender distinction. And we know from studies in Corinth that this was a big issue. We think of the worship of Dionysus. We think of other expressions where there was a lot of cross-dressing. There was a lot of gender confusion. And if I was to simplify it, and I know it's controversial, in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul is saying, men, make sure you look like a man. Women, make sure you look like a woman. So why, when people say to me, is 1 Corinthians relevant in 2023? You better believe it. I said last week, the church I was visiting at and speaking, I said, if I was asked what's the biggest issue facing the church now, and it will be in the future, it's not going away, it's this whole issue of gender. Look at our schools. And it trickles into church life. So we have to wrestle with that. What is Paul after? Is it a concern, this idea of men? in a cultural appropriate way look like a man, and women in a culturally appropriate way look like a woman. Now, traditionally, when it comes to Paul's concern, people would say he's concerned about hierarchy, the idea of authority and submission. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. Yesterday's coronation service was fantastic. It was such a clear declaration of the gospel. Rick, I almost turned Anglican yesterday as I listened to that service. And kudos to those who put it together, because the gospel was declared worldwide. And I have a great respect for the current Bishop of Canterbury. It was a fabulous, fabulous message. But he talked a lot about the authority that was being conferred upon the king and implications for us today. Another issue, though, that I think Paul is after, and I've drifted more personally this way, is the issue of shame and honor as it applied to that culture. The idea of being dishonoring or disrespectful or drawing undue attention to self. And I think this is a very significant issue, especially when it comes to the matter of corporate worship. And if you read through 1 Corinthians 11, 2-16, do this later today or this week, notice how many times Paul is talking about shame or dishonor, glory, a lot of these terms that have to do with shame and honor, which would be very critical values in that society, I think even to a degree in our society. Well, let's get to the key questions. The $88,000 question, what is headship? The word kephale is found throughout this passage. There are likely 2,000 articles I'm aware of written on the meaning of the word. There's somebody right now as I speak who's putting out another book or article on that Greek word. Literally, the Greek word means head, as in that part of your body from the neck up, your head. But there's a couple of other meanings. Traditionally, the meaning of authority has been implied from the usage of that word in verses 3 and 4. Wayne Grudem did a famous study 20 years ago, maybe now. He looked at 2,500 usages of the word and came to the conclusion that in almost every case, even in extra biblical research, it involves this idea of authority. Problem is, the more common word for authority is exousia, which is actually used a bit later in 1 Corinthians 11, and we wonder why Paul doesn't use that word. It's why many, especially who have a little more progressive view, would argue that the word head means source or origin, like the headwater. And definitely later in 1 Corinthians 11, in the passage that we're looking at, Paul does have this idea of creation, woman coming from man, reverses it, man coming from woman in the birthing process. But that's become very popular. I don't want to get complicated here, but I can almost predict someone who is complementarian, who has a traditional view of the role of men and women, will always lean towards the hierarchical viewpoint, authority and submission. Those who are egalitarian, a lot of people these days, egalitarian in evangelical circles, usually push the source origin idea. And if you're going, that makes no sense to me, that's okay, but I think it's important to clarify it. The literal meaning of head is a position of prominence, a kind of the top, and you ask the question, well, then what does that mean? Now, many of us would imply that would then imply authority or leadership. It's like a race car driver being in the pole position. It's a position of prominence, which doesn't mean that the other racers are inferior, are not in a position. I like to, if I take that literal position, it would be that men have a priority responsibility and expectations when it comes to glorifying God in partnership with women. And that's a loaded statement. You're going to rewind and listen to that again. So I take a position, and I realize this could be controversial, of what I call qualified authority. So I'm qualifying the word authority. And as we were reminded yesterday in the coronation celebration, Jesus redefines authority. Jesus had a problem with how authority was being exercised in his day. People were abusing it, lording over people, and Jesus had the audacity to say, those in authority are called to serve. And the rector yesterday over and over and over reminded King Charles that in his position of authority, his role is not to be served, but to serve. And that is Jesus' teaching when it comes to authority. Those who are put in positions of authority are called to serve and to serve others. Now, it's also important, I like sometimes when I look at a word like authority, to say what it's not. And listen carefully. Authority does not mean the other person is inferior. Women are not inferior to men. Women are not second class to men. There's no lacking of equality. Equality is there. We celebrate that with the Trinity, the equality in the Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit, just as we do in human relationships. When it comes to authority, it doesn't mean that the fellow makes all the decisions, his wife defers. In fact, I would argue that we need a partnership in decisions where there's mutual dialogue. But I do have a little story that I came across this week, which I quite enjoy. Some of you know the name Tim Keller. Tim Keller's wife is quite formidable, but there came a time with Tim Keller where he was pastoring in rural United States and felt God's call to New York City. His wife didn't get that same sense of calling, and she kind of argued, I think we should stay where we are. Tim Keller, being a good, godly, loving husband, said to her, you know, we are going back and forth on this issue. I'm prepared to defer to you. I want to give you the final word. Isn't that loving? Mrs. Keller looked at him straight in the face, Tim Keller shares, and said, no way. You be a man. She said, you are called to take initiative when it comes to our home and in the church. I'm going to partner with you. I appreciate there's been deliberation. 99% of the time we are in agreement, we have consensus. But she said, I am called in this situation to honor the authority that you have in that way. Now, this is where we go on a little limb. Qualified authority. Can women lead in the church? Absolutely yes. 2 weeks from today, if I'm going to do any justice to 1 Corinthians 12, women have the gift of leadership in the church. Full stop, period. Can women preach? My answer is yes. If I take what's said here in verse 4 and 5 seriously, back in my older days, we just left that statement out about women praying and prophesying. Prophesying is actually best understood as preach. But what about 1 Corinthians 14, where women are to be silent? How can you be are you to mime your preaching? No. We'll cover that in our sermon on 1 Corinthians 14. Can women be elders? This is a good question for an annual meeting. And I think we have an annual meeting coming up. So, hey, if you want to take a shot at it, both Rick and Patrick are more than prepared to, maybe even Ron in the financial report could take a crack at that. I do have a view or two on that issue. Yeah. The final thing I'm going to say about authority is the nature of authority. Authority is not a dirty word, and unfortunately it's become that way. We're all called to submit to someone, and Jesus submits to the Father. I mean, he sees it as an honorable calling, a wonderful opportunity to express his relationship with his Father. There's no issue of inferiority or inequality. I like using the example of a police officer. If a police officer comes into this church, I do believe I have pastoral authority. I'm called to serve and protect that man as I try to do that with the congregation. When we step out the door, I submit to his authority. His calling is to serve and protect me as he exercises authority. Oh, by the way, I missed a point. Can women be in positions of authority outside of the church? Absolutely. In Paul's day, there were a lot of women CEOs. So what we're saying here, this is where we need this flexibility when it comes to this topic, is pertaining to churches and our homes. Also, we need to pick up, just as I leave this, is the issue of interdependence, verses 11 and 12. And it's a partnership, men and women partnering and working together. Let me say this, it's an appropriate Sunday to say this. This church does not survive without women. And I would argue that over a span of years here, I believe the key to ministry effectiveness has always been faithful women. And if you walk out today in any shape or form and feel like I've diminished the value of women, then I want to apologize in advance. Women keep our homes going, they keep our churches going, they keep the world going. God knew what he was doing when he created women. This issue of shame has to do with mutual respect and mutual honor, which I see as a key theme in 1 Corinthians 11. So let me cover head covering real quick. In my studies and research, especially over the last couple of weeks, I'm more convinced than ever that the Jews and Greeks back in Paul's day, back in the first century in Corinth, head covering for women was just a social practice. Women in public had their heads covered. It was what we would call a cultural norm. When Paul uses that word natural in about verses 12 and 13, don't let it fool you. It actually has to do with what is natural or normal given those times. What is a natural cultural expression? Were women wearing veils, hoods, part of their shawl that they kind of would wrap up over their head? There's a lot of debate. Hairstyle, hair length, I believe later in our passage that Paul uses as an illustration that's appropriate to that day, where men tended to have their hair shorter, women longer, but the issue, to make any sense, would be at some kind of external covering like a veil or a hat. We have to ask a good question. What was being communicated then? Yes, what was being communicated could be the importance of headship, but I also believe the importance of respect and honor. You see, an unveiled woman back then communicated promiscuity, availability. It would be like a woman who is married having her head uncovered, a woman who maybe would have a wedding ring and would just take it off when she was to go out into public. It would be seen as something that would be culturally inappropriate. We also know that prostitutes back then, unfortunately, were forced to have their heads shaved and their hair shortened. And I find it intriguing that Paul's words apply to not just wives but women in general. And as a ex-prostitute, for example, would come into a church setting, she could have her head covered. It was actually seen as a privilege. Here's a key, a symbol of belonging. And that's very important in that culture and in ours today. So why did some women maybe have their heads uncovered? Was it maybe a quest for freedom? Maybe feeling that I want to express equality in my way? Unfortunately for society, it was seen as a sign of disrespect and a lack of modesty to have your hair uncovered back then. It was also being disrespectful to a husband or for men in the congregation. And you say, well, does that even matter? In premarital counseling over the years, I've done an interesting exercise. It's actually to measure openness and honesty with a couple. And I'll say a scenario like you're going out and your partner feels like you're dressed inappropriately. Should they tell you that? And what would you do about it? Most men say, yeah, I'd like to know, and it's kind of a mild response. With women, it is very different. With women, they're very quick to say it's a matter of concern about respect and wanting to preserve their reputation, wanting to be a good reflection on my spouse or partner in terms of what is being understood or what is being stood for. And I find that interesting that women particularly seem to have that concern. I want to be respectful. I don't want to be a poor reflection. I am concerned about my spouse's reputation, as we all should be. So the last 2 minutes, some final application on what has been, as I said, a very difficult topic. Avoid extremes. Let us not over or under apply 1 Corinthians 11, 2-16. When it comes to rights and freedoms, we may say, I have the right to wear whatever I want to. I have the freedom. I am just saying we need to ask the question, what is culturally appropriate in 2023? What things do we need to communicate to the world that's watching? We're told in this passage angels are watching, and we're told that there's other people in public settings who are watching. So I think takeaways. This biblical view of gender distinctions is something that we need to work through. We need to promote mutual respect and a mutual honor. And to me, a big takeaway has to do with modesty. If modesty was the issue in play back in first century Corinth, it's a big issue for us today. So what does it mean in 2023 to be modest? What does it mean for men and women to be modest? Back then, there was a whole different meaning. What does it mean today? Back then, for a man to have a head covering usually was connotated with pagan worship, where they would put up their hood, and that was symbolic of worshiping one of the deities. Do I have a problem with men with long hair? No. Is it wrong for a man to wear a cap to church? No. What's on the cap might be a matter. So if you're wearing a cap that says, Satan's choice, it might not be an appropriate hat. One of those political caps, don't start wearing those here to Byron. I won't enforce that, but I don't think it's a good idea. What about a muscle shirt? Is it wrong or right for a guy to wear a muscle shirt? Keep in mind that one of the issues, too, is not only honoring, but distracting, because we want the worship to go to God. We don't want our attire to distract people from the worship of God. So is it right for a man to wear a muscle shirt to church? For the women to be going, man, look at his abs. Look at the. It's one of the reasons I don't wear a muscle shirt when I preach. Why are you guys laughing? It's the truth. I'm very careful that way. Hey, for women, I almost am fearful to get into this. Women, and please apply, don't be suggestive in your clothing. I have a lot of space when it comes to what's appropriate. Hair length for women, I don't think it's an issue. Short, long, just make sure it's nice. Dresses or skirts, no. You can wear jeans to church, that's not a problem. Super tight jeans, I don't think are appropriate. A halter top to church, you don't want to be a distraction to others. You want to be respectful, and you're wanting to be honoring to one another. Hey, I just have one final point. You can get your attire right and blow it when it comes to what really matters. In Colossians, Paul says, clothe yourselves with humility, gentleness, and above all, put on love. Let us be modest. Let us be culturally appropriate. I am never going to say you must not have your head covered if you're a woman with a hat or a veil. I would challenge you, what message does it communicate to our culture? Is it understood? If visitors were to come in, would they appreciate the significance of what it is you're wearing? People appreciate modesty and that kind of healthy approach. Rick's going to come. We're just going to have a final song before we then transition into our annual meeting.